Hi, this is William with the series on Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich's 1921 diary entries. He was 29 years old, and he and other Tsarist Russians and non-Bolshevik Russians are outside of Russia, and specifically, he is these days in among those who emigrated to France. So he's living in Paris, and we have jumped ahead from the 14th of January to the 31st of January because of Dmitri's rather idiosyncratic way of keeping his diaries, where he wrote one very long, very detailed diary entry with some, cathartic expression of emotion and opinion and, everything that was really important that needed to be developed and not just mentioned went into these long diary entries. And so he would do them first. So he would actually write this on the 31st, and then he would go in and write about each day between the 15th and the 30th. Okay, so this I have to do, of course, these long ones that can be over 20 pages long in portions rather than all at once. And this is a relatively small portion, but it's a very, very important one. And if those of you who are waiting for the diary entries and the beginning of the relationship with Coco Chanel, all of this is important. And in fact, even political issues are important, because the political activities in the Tsarist Russian monarch emigration will be directly related, believe it or not, to the beginning of Dmitri's relationship with Coco. All right, so we are on the 31st of January on the old Russian pre-revolutionary calendar, but in Paris it is actually the 18th of February. The year is 1921. It's a Monday. Paris, of course, and as usual, Dmitri adds his address, which was 76 Rue Miromesnil, where he had an apartment. So here we go. In my previous entries, I said that apart from me and without the participation of my direct will, fate is inexorably pushing me toward the implementation of a very important role in Russia. In the almost 2 weeks since I returned from Monte Carlo, I've had a great many interesting conversations, and for the first time in the course of the past 2 years, something is actually beginning to happen in the sense of work, naturally in an anti-Bolshevik direction. My opinion has always been quite definite on that issue. I found and find more than ever that no serious action will ever be taken by the Trepov Group. These are all arch bureaucrats and courtiers who persist in the old way of thinking, who approach Russia from the perspective of their ministerial posts or that of ruined landowners. So, maybe doesn't sound that interesting on the surface, but if you really want to understand Dmitri, this is the real Dmitri. This is the man that Dmitri liked to think of himself as being, as opposed to the man who was a compulsive gambler and sometimes feeling like he was superfluous and leading just, a pointless existence. So, how to take this apart? Well, if you listen to the parts of the long diary entry of the 15th of January, the previous long diary entry, then you know he talked a great deal about the idea that fate itself had singled him out to be the next Tsar. Here he says merely that it's pushing him toward a very important role in Russia, but we all know, and he knows, what that role is as he conceives it. Okay, so he was away in Monte Carlo, so he was a little out of touch, aside from discussing the Sokolov investigation with Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich and Grand Duke Andrei Vladimirovich. But he informs us, rather surprisingly, that in the 2 weeks since he left Monte Carlo, he's had what he calls a great many interesting conversations. So when did he have these? I'm not sure, because we have his daily diary entries, and it sounds like his days were pretty full. Going from, lunch to dinner to tea to the theater with various people. And he mentions Galeevsky coming and seeing him in the morning. And Galeevsky was an active monarchist in the Russian emigration, but I don't know, maybe they were telephone conversations. And he just decided to wait and write about them when he did his long diary entry. So, yeah, no reason to doubt that he truly did have a great many interesting conversations during that 2-week period. And he's happy because he feels like, for the very first time in the past 2 years since the monarchist movement started in the emigration, finally something is actually beginning to happen, and work is being done in an anti-Bolshevik direction, of course. So what happened over the past 2 years? Well, the Civil War. So people were kind of waiting to see how that was going to work out. And at first it seemed, at some point in 1920, toward the end of 1920, I think, it peaked. The success of the Tsarists and the White Russians peaked. But before that, there'd been a lot of optimism that if we just hold out a little bit in the emigration, all of this is going to be taken care of. And at one point, the White Russian troops came very close to St. Petersburg, and everybody was on pins and needles waiting for that to happen. But now the theater of operations has shifted from military to political, and it has shifted from Russia itself to Paris, which was sort of the émigré center, although there were plenty of émigrés in other countries. So Dmitri's ideal was always this idea of the man of action, the opposite of the superfluous man, the lishny человек. And so that's why now he's happy with this. When he first arrived in Paris, some months before this diary entry was written, he started meeting with the Trepov Group and with various monarchists, and he was just so discouraged and disappointed with his perception, exactly as he describes it here, that they were all talk and no action. So now he's returning to that. Back then, the main issue that he was trying to get them to act on was, with Kirill's arrival in France, to do something to make it clear, to intervene, to make it clear, to go to Kirill himself and say, look, you will never be the emperor in exile, you will never be sort of the flagship Romanov and the rallying point. And so Dmitri wanted them to do that actively, and they didn't, and that frustrated him. Okay, so this time he's saying, my opinion has always been quite definite, and he's right. That's one thing that he hasn't wavered on. That the Trepov Group will never actually take any action. And the reason why? Well, they're all arch bureaucrats and courtiers. That in itself isn't a problem. You know, Dmitry actually tried to form and to maintain relationships with political leaders in Russia, like the Minister of Finance, who became the Prime Minister. Kakovtsov was his name, one of the best, if you ask me. And Dmitry really wanted to have contact with these people, and he wasn't, say, an anti-institutionalist or anti-establishment. But in this instance, he's saying that it's not so much that they're arch bureaucrats and courtiers, is that they persist in the old way of thinking. And they're approaching Russia, and they're forming their strategies from the perspective that their old ministerial perspective, and their perspective as landowners who have lost everything. That's the way they're looking at Russia and strategizing for the future, and that's just not going to work. And these are serious people. We'll talk about Trepov in a minute, and it's almost breathtaking the extent to which Dmitry is willing to sort of roll his eyes at them. You know, him being this young fellow of 29 who never in his life held a ministerial post and was educated at a cavalry school. How dare he, sort of a thing. But no, he's right. These men were mired in the old way of thinking about Russia, and bringing Imperial Russia back with some sort of, reforms and concessions to modernity, but basically the way it was before. And that is just not going to work. That's a fantasy. And for Dmitry, even before he joined Young Russia, the Young Russia Group and the Young Russia Party, which, the name says it all, they were looking towards the youth in immigration and towards Russia's future rather than at the past. And so, this was not going to fly with him, this idea of, even though these are very serious people, they can't adjust. They can't modernize their ideas. And Dmitry was particularly popular with the young monarchists in the emigration. And that wasn't, these weren't old people. Trepov was only 50 at this time. But, they weren't, I agree with him on that. So let's talk about Trepov. So Trepov was one of 3 or 4 brothers who were very active and very prominently active and successful in the military and the civil service of Russia before the revolution. And in fact, we have sort of a convergence here with the diary entries, because in yesterday's 1906 diary entry, Dmitry talked about the death of Dmitry Trepov and how it didn't make him sad. There were several deaths, and the other people, it all made him sad that they had passed away. But in the case of Dmitry Trepov, it didn't make him sad. He would have known the Trepov brothers because the Trepovs were in Moscow, and Dmitry Trepov had played an important role. He was the head of the sort of law enforcement, the police element in Moscow under Grand Duke Sergei, if I'm not mistaken. He was very much a hardliner like Grand Duke Sergei. And so Dmitry would have known Dmitry Trepov, in the way, only in the way that a child can know an adult who's not part of his own family. But now we have his brother, Alexander. So Alexander Fyodorovich, and Alexander was, he was the cream of the crop in Russia. He was the prime minister of Russia, and at the same time also the minister of transportation. And he was vehemently opposed to Rasputin He was a monarchist, absolutely a monarchist. He was conservative, but he also was in favor of sort of moderate incremental reforms in Russia. So he was, he was a centrist, conservative monarchist and a man of intelligence and education, and a man who was going to, hold a steady course in the government. But his opposition to Rasputin, of course, put him at odds with Alexandra, whom I read actually came to hate him, so much so that she wanted him to be hanged. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. The story is told that she wanted Dmitri to be shot after the Rasputin assassination, which of course Nicholas didn't allow. And so he has a strong connection to Dmitri in that respect, that he opposed Rasputin. He was outspoken in opposing Rasputin, and he understood, like Dmitri did, that Rasputin's role in politics was absolutely disastrous. But instead of trying to assassinate Rasputin, his idea was to offer Rasputin a huge bribe, a truly grand ducal amount of money, if he would agree to leave the capital, go back to Siberia, and no longer meddle in politics. But Rasputin was not actually a person motivated by money. Say what you will about him, he had that one thing in his favor. So he wasn't, when he had money, he would give it away, and it just never was a big deal for him. And so, of course, he went right to the Empress, to Alexandra, and told her that Trepov had tried to bribe him, and she told Nicholas, and so he didn't last very long as prime minister. He became prime minister on the 23rd of September 1916. I believe that's the Gregorian calendar, and he was forced to resign that post on the 9th of January 1917. So he only lasted a few months, but those months when he was in power corresponded with the plot and then the implementation of the plot to kill Rasputin, the successful assassination. And clearly he was someone on the side of the conspirators, though I can't say if he knew in advance about the conspiracy. I'm guessing probably not. Felix Yusupov, in his book about the Rasputin assassination, says that he approached another liberal Duma member. Well, Trepov wasn't a liberal, but he approached a quite liberal Duma member, Maklakov, I don't know. I always have trouble with stress in Russian pronunciation, but that individual declined to participate in the assassination, but of course didn't give the assassins away. So, it would be interesting to know if Dmitri had contact with Trepov, and I'm inclined to believe that he probably did, because Trepov was exactly the kind of person that he was inclined to have contact with and try to develop ties with, if not a close relationship. So in exile, Trepov became the president of the Union of Monarchist Organizations in Russia, and he was very actively involved, and I think one of the earliest to organize monarchist organizations in the emigration. And in fact, he was a brilliant organizer. He may not have been a man of action, but if you wanted something to be organized, Trepov was your man. He had been a very capable minister of transportation. And interestingly, here's another convergence that we have today with my other project, which is the history of Sanatorium Shatzel, where Dmitri actually died in 1942. And Trepov was working in the emigration with these monarchist organizations together with his brother-in-law, Alexander Mosolov, And Mosolov and his entire family were at Schatzalp in 1914, right before the war broke out. His children and himself and his wife, and he didn't stay. Two of the children stayed. They must have been genuinely ill, but the other members of the family kind of came and went. So that interested me when I found out. I don't suppose it's very interesting to many of you. But Trepov and his brother-in-law Mosolov would be going off to a big monarchist conference coming up shortly that year in Bad Reichenhall in what do I want to say? In Germany, okay, because a lot of the monarchists and a lot of the people who were right of center in the Russian immigration settled in Germany. The ones who were in France tended to be more the intellectuals, the people who had been in the Duma, in the civil service, and who were, professional military men who weren't, ideologues, and they were the ones who tended to live in France. So, so Alexander Trepov was a person who was, when he was still in the government, and by the way, I should have added that he was one of the drafters of the plan to create the Duma, the parliamentary body in Russia, after the 1905 revolution, and he was one of the drafters of the October Manifesto. So even though you can't call him liberal, by the standards of that day with the autocracy, he was very much a reformer and a non-extremist. And he actually was, his proposals were actually accepted by the socialist intellectual professor Milyukov, Pavel Milyukov, whom Dmitry would himself approach in London after the revolution, and who would continue to be, to some extent, supportive of Dmitry as a positive and constructive member of the imperial family, unlike others in the emigration. Okay, so I have to say that I am impressed that Dmitry had these kind of people around him, that these kind of people came to him and gathered around him, and he'd been in close contact, working together with this Trepov group until things kind of blew up because he came to the conclusion that they were just not going to think of Russia from the perspective of the future and take into account some of the aspects of the Russian Revolution that could actually be good and that could be worked with and encompassed. And Dmitry himself has a little bit, don't get me wrong, but a little bit of an identification with the revolutionaries, because he too, one of the reasons why he was so directly involved in the Rasputin assassination was because he too thought there needed to be not just change, but big change in Russia. So hence his frustration with these men. Now, when he says work is starting to be done, and something is actually beginning to happen, then we don't know yet what he means. So we'll find that out later in this diary entry, and we'll find it out in a big way because he himself is going to go to Germany and meet with some people, and he'll attend one of the two monarchist conferences that take place there, and I shouldn't say more because it turns out to be a very, very interesting event. But I can say that the person who finally attracted Dmitry's attention as being a real, genuine man of action was Kazanbek, Alexander Kazanbek, the founder of the Young Russia movement and then the Young Russia Party. But that lies fairly far in the future, and I've gone too long, so I'll stop now. But please do come back, and please do bear in mind that this, as I say, is the authentic Dmitry, and this is all important stuff leading up to what he does in the future, including with Coco Chanel. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.